before introducing our special guest and our special guest host. So let me say Happy New Year to everyone. And as I say, I'm from Square Books. I'm very excited about this very first Square Books event of 2021 for several reasons. We will be celebrating a new work, just an excellent novel by Michael Farris Smith, a Mississippi native. Michael has lived in Oxford for the last 4 or maybe 5 years. You can correct me on that, Michael, if I'm not right. With his wife, Sabria, and 2 daughters. He's the author of 8 books of fiction, including Rivers, Desperation Road, The Fighter, and its sequel published last year, which is 2020, Blackwood. And today we're featuring his new novel, Nick, which comes out tomorrow, published under the estimable imprint of Little Brown. Nick is a prequel, but not to one of his own books. I think as probably most of you know, it is the prequel to F. Scott Fitzgerald's great Gatsby, a giant of American literature. Just to be clear, 3 days ago, the copyright to Gatsby and everything about it expired. After 95 years of the book's initial publication in 1925, as you might be interested, that other books that lost copyright this year include Aerosmith, Mrs. Dalloway, Hemingway's In Our Time, Theodore Dreiser's American Tragedy, and The Manhattan Transfer by John Dos Passos. We are also now seeing, or soon shall see, new editions of Gatsby, or with new introductions and different publishers other than Scribner's, the original publishers. One has an introduction by Jesmyn Ward. This is the old standard Gatsby. Here's one with an introduction by Min Jin Lee, and there's another one coming. I don't have a cover of it. That's got an introduction by John Grisham from one of the Random House imprints. And then there is an illustrated edition that I just found today in the store, which has some sort of vintage Art Deco style illustration. So with all this Gatsby coming up in the news, I think a lot of people are going to be interested in Nick. And I think as soon as they pick up Nick and start to read it, they're not going to be able to put it down. Richard Russo has called Michael Farris Smith's Nick masterful, and Robert Owen Butler speculated that The Great Gatsby may, quote, forever feel like Nick's splendid but somewhat paler sequel. Just today, I wrote up Square Books' top 100 bestsellers of 2020, which should be on our website soon, if it's not already. And Blackwood was number 14. And I commented there that this time next year, Nick will be among our top 15 2021 bestsellers. That's my only prediction of the year so far. By the way, we have for order signed copies of Nick, and probably can fill an order for an inscribed copy if you forgot about somebody at Christmas, or thinking about somebody in the new year. Just email or telephone us or order from Square Books online. We have a special guest host today, Maureen Lee Lenker, an award-winning journalist. She is a digital staff writer at Entertainment Weekly, where she covers books, theater, movies, and television. She's also the Entertainment Weekly romance columnist and a classic film aficionado. She holds a master's degree in journalism from the University of Southern California and a master's in British history from the University of Oxford, the other Oxford. Thank you, Maureen, for hosting this today, and Michael, congratulations. One little detail, somewhere toward the end of this conversation, my image is about to leave the screen here, and when I reappear, we'll take some questions from the audience. So be thinking about what you would like to ask. Maureen and Michael, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Richard. And I just want to say before we dive into questions, if anyone is interested to check out a sampling of that John Grisham introduction, we shared an excerpt of it on Entertainment Weekly's website. So you can go there and look for it if you're interested. But now on to Michael and Nick. So Nick, let's start by talking about your relationship with The Great Gatsby and when you first encountered the book and how it's evolved over the years, bringing you up to this point with your prequel coming out tomorrow.
Yeah, it wasn't one of those things that like hit me right away about Nick, because the first time I read Nick, I was probably, 20 years old, and the first time I read Gatsby, I was 20 years old, and probably like a lot of people at that age reading it, didn't get it. I remember just tossing it aside and thinking, I don't know what the big deal is. And then you fast forward till I was about 7 or 8 years later, I had actually been living abroad for 3 or 4 years. And during that time, I had started, reading a lot of The Lost Generation and like really feeling that vibe because I was in Paris, and just, it just really began, just kind of seep into me, because I kind of really attached to their notions of, are there questions, I think, about home and what it is, and is it a feeling, is it a place, like what is it exactly? And I read Gatsby then, and I remember thinking, well, there actually might be something to this after all, But even then, like I hadn't started writing yet, I was still like a couple of years away from trying to write, or decided that's what I really wanted to give a go at. And I didn't read it again. You fast forward to like 14 or 15 more years. 2014, Rivers had come out, and I was sitting around in my house one day, and I was looking for something to read, and I just saw Gatsby sitting there on the shelf, and I thought, well, I don't really remember much of anything about it, which I'm kind of ashamed to say, and it's short, so I think I'll read it. I think a lot of times we're looking for something short to read, so I picked it up and I started reading it, and I mean, I've said this before in a couple of interviews, like it was the most probably surreal reading experience I've ever had, and that I felt like just every page seemed to just be speaking to me in some way, not just because of the beauty of the language, but there was something about Nick that I was particularly drawn to throughout the entire thing. And then the moment when the novel and when Nick really struck me was toward the end of Gatsby, when Nick realizes it's his birthday all of a sudden, and it's late afternoon, evening, and he's just now realizing it's his birthday. And then in the next sentence, he's about to turn 30, and he describes that decade as a decade of loneliness. It's what he's anticipating, and that just it absolutely grabbed hold of me in a way I was never expecting. And I remember I took the book, and I didn't even finish in that moment. I took it and I just set it aside, because part of my writing life and kind of making it to finally have some success, I really have thought a lot about how I was 29 years old when I came back to Mississippi and decided that's what I wanted to do. And I came back to a hometown I had been away from for a decade. And my friends had done things like get jobs, get married, have children, buy houses, kind of real world stuff. While I had not necessarily been doing such real world stuff up to that point. And I remember feeling a little bit alien, and here I was thinking I wanted to try writing. I didn't even know what the hell that meant, I don't think. But I felt it was probably going to be a very lonely stretch ahead of me. And it was. And the decade of my 30s, when he said he expected it to be a decade of loneliness, it just stuck with me. I opened the book back up, I finished reading it, and then I just kept thinking about Nick, and I kept thinking about my own life, and how during my decade of the 30s, I had managed to try to write, fail miserably, get rejected over and over and over and over again. I got married. I had 2 daughters. All the things that happen to us in life. I lost people I loved. We moved from one place to the next. And then somehow through all that, I finally, when I hit 40, published my first book. And I had survived that decade of loneliness. And I just remember thinking about Nick and his story and how he anticipated that. And the very simple thought crossed my mind. It would be really interesting if someone were to write his story. And it just almost before I could finish the thought, I thought, well, why don't you do it? And it was, I hate to simplify it, but that's really how it came to me. And I knew in that moment I was going to do it come hell or high water. So I guess that's the fairly long version of how we're sitting here tonight talking about this.
Well, I'm 31 and a writer, so I guess I have a lot of loneliness to look forward to myself. But um, as Richard mentioned, the copyright expired just a few days ago. How did that figure into your process? Was it something you were aware of or working towards? Did you have to talk to the estate and then wait it out? What was all of that like?
It's been a crazy experience with this novel, because when I had that idea, like I realized, if you're going to do this, it's nuts, first of all, because you're going to put it, it's a very small target to hit. And I didn't tell anybody about it. I didn't tell my agent, I didn't tell my editor, because I didn't want to be told it's impossible or it's almost impossible, any of those things. So I very quietly sat and wrote the novel. And the copyright issue never crossed my mind. Like, I never even considered it. I never thought about it when I was writing the novel. And when I got done with it, I turned it in to my agent, and she's like, "You did what?" It's like, "Yeah, I've written Nick Carraway." And the publisher was like, "You did what?" I was like, "Yeah, that's what we have here." And then that's when we realized, well, it can't be published for 5 more years because of copyright issues. And so we sat very quietly for 5 years with this novel on the shelf, not talking about it, not mentioning it, because I was freaked out about several things. One, I was concerned the copyright issue, that the copyright would get extended and that I'd have to wait another 5 or 10 years or whatever. And the other thing was, like, if news of this leaks out or gets out, somebody's gonna, I mean, who knows who might do what, and then I won't be the one standing there when it's over with. And I was kind of devastated, to be honest, when I first figured that out. But in the meantime, I was like, okay, now you've got 5 years, right? You got this novel waiting. I had kind of a draft of Desperation Road at that time, so I finished and published it. And then in the meantime, I wrote The Fighter, and I wrote Blackwood. And all of a sudden, when I went back to revise Nick last year, I realized I was a better writer than I was in 2015 because of my experiences with keeping on trucking along, And so in a weird way, while I was devastated about it then, Nick is a better novel now than it would have been if it was published 4 or 5 years ago, just because I'm a better writer now than I was then.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, how did it evolve in those 5 years? I mean, it sounds like it changed at least a little bit when you picked it back up to revise.
Yeah, I would say, like, in general, like, the plot line, or I hate using that word, but the chronology of the novel didn't really change that much. I did go in and expand some things, but it was weird because looking through that draft, it's weird editing yourself from 5 years ago, right? There would be, like, I remember there were pages of dialogue that I just took a pen and marked through, and I was like, who wrote this? It's not Smith, And I remember one page of dialogue in particular, I marked through it and I wrote the word yuck across the top of the page with an exclamation point, So it was a matter of making the sentences better, making the scenes more organic, I think, making the dialogue more real, true to life, and what the characters were going through. Those were the really big things. And like I said, I'm very happy it happened this way now, because the sentences and the atmospheric nature of the book are better than they were then, simply because I've written a lot of atmosphere, and I've written a lot of landscape, and I've written a lot of heartbreak and hustle in the last 5 years. And I think that really paid off with Nick.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that atmosphere, the book's really divided into 2 halves. The first half is in World War I and in Paris of World War I, and throughout France. And then the second half is in New Orleans and has this real Southern Gothic feel that I would say is very much in keeping with your writing style and your previous novels. How did you decide that both of those spaces were the places where Nick should live and that these were going to be the two predominant settings for your story?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think people who read Nick will see that Nick is more episodic, I think, than anything I've done up until this point, and that it covers a span of several years, a couple, 3 years. It moves from the Great War to Paris to New Orleans. The war thing came about simply because I was pretty affected by in his and Gatsby's relationship. I felt like they had this connection because of the war. That's one of the very first things they say to each other when they meet. And then also in Hemingway's movable Feast, Hemingway says, "We didn't trust anyone who wasn't in the war." And that kind of stuck with me also. And I believe that Nick was, I believe that someone like Nick who could detach from himself the way that he does to where he doesn't even realize it's his own birthday. By the way, today is my birthday. And I didn't forget. I remembered.
Happy birthday!
Yeah, thank you very much. The war seemed like a logical place for me to start, simply because of the traumatic nature of what they went through and those who survived it went through. And we know enough about PTSD now, what they carried home with them. And then the New Orleans part came along because when he does come back home after the war, he doesn't want to go home. I think we see in Gatsby, he's disillusioned with home and what it means and all the things he kind of learned to accept, and he doesn't want to accept them anymore. And I had him in the train station in Chicago, and he can either get on the train and go on home, or in a spur of the moment, he doesn't want to go home, and he just boards a train, picks one. And I thought, why not go to New Orleans? It's a place I love to write about. It's a place I know. And like in looking up what New Orleans was like in 1919, it was an incredible place to like set a story. So I sent him there so he could kind of, recover's the wrong word, because I think his whole story is about a recovery that he maybe does or doesn't get to. And it was just kind of like, the war was incredible to write about. Paris, I have a love affair with Paris and have been very influenced by that city. And then I can say the same thing about New Orleans. So I think it was just my opportunity to take this story that I loved and put it in all the places that I love, to bring it kind of all together.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? My internet was being slow a little bit.
Yeah, it's cool. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Good. Yes. So without spoiling anything, Nick in this story, he really has this sort of knack for being a witness to great trauma and great romantic tragedy. And that's obviously a role he also fulfills in The Great Gatsby as the narrator of that story and observer of all the things that are happening in Gatsby and the Buchanan's lives. So how did you suss out that parallel and fulfilling or building up to that role as observer or narrator?
Right. Well, one of the things to balance in writing something like this is he already has characteristics that it would be a sin not to ascribe to those. There's little breadcrumbs throughout Gatsby of kind of who he is. So how do I create the guy who is truly a wallflower in Gatsby? And so I wanted to create those experiences for him, the personal experience where he where I think he tries and he fails. I mean, I think we all do that. We all have those moments in our lives, those relationships where we try and things don't work, and then it affects how we do it the next time. I felt like Nick and Gatsby had been on the wrong end of some things that had led him to be a wallflower, that had led him to kind of judge the way he does. And part of Nick was putting him into these situations where we see him on the cusp of like maybe having something beautiful or maybe having something that would change his path forever. But then, there's the fork in the road where it doesn't quite work out. And we can all look at our lives, our own lives, and see those forks in the road. I didn't want to ignore the fact that he was the wallflower in Gatsby, but I also wanted to put him in situations where he had the opportunity, and because of his own bad decisions or failed decisions or inability to grasp his own emotions, he finally does become that person who would rather stand off, than engage.
Yeah. Nick is a storyteller. That's how we meet him in Gatsby. How does writing the origin story of a storyteller, so someone who shares a lot with you as a person, invite self-reflection, or how did it impact you as a writer?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a very good question. Um, it's almost like you're looking through a double lens, like I'm telling the story through one lens, but through his lens, he's seeing and he's using these things that catapult him into being a storyteller himself. And that was one of the other nuggets I guess I had to consider. His relationship with Ella and his relationship later with Julia and Colette and the things he's seen and observing. I had to grow him, and I think I did. I grew him into being the storyteller. I think by the end of Nick, you begin to see how he embraces, at least on some level, the things that he's been a part of and witnessed, and how he begins as a way to cope with it, which I think a lot of us do that too. A lot of people keep journals, or they write. Like, I know I write fiction in large part to help me embrace the world and try to make some sense of the world. And so to like funnel that through Nick and have him take these things he's seen and done and eventually kind of start to put it down on a page to become the person who tells us the story of Gatsby was a really interesting experience, like me feeding a story through a guy who's feeding eventually himself, the same story. It was a dynamic I haven't worked with before, but I think that's one of the cool things about doing anything creative is to keep doing things and trying to do things that aren't the same process you've used before. Keep trying to challenge yourself, and that was certainly part of it because he has such an interesting way of viewing the world. How can I legitimize that for him and for me? I think.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a series of quote unquote rapid fire questions before Richard rejoins us to ask some audience questions. So I want to start by asking, what is your favorite prequel or sequel, whether it be literary or pop culture?
I was very influenced by the writer Jean Rhys, who wrote some great novels in the 30s. And then she disappeared for like 30 years, and she shows up with Wide Sargasso Sea. That novel, I guess that novel was somewhere in my subconscious of taking a character from a famous literary work that you were immensely immersed in and find some attachment to, and then just doing it, for whatever reason. To go pop culture, I have absolutely gone crazy over the Mandalorian on Disney Channel because I'll be honest, like growing up a Star Wars guy as a kid, like the last few Star Wars haven't really like grabbed me like that, but the Mandalorian, oh my God, it's brought me right back to it all, and that's been very fun to see.
It's really excellent storytelling, yes. Which Gatsby do you prefer, Robert Redford or Leonardo DiCaprio?
Oh man. That's a good one. I dig Leo. I mean, I dig Robert Redford too, though. He's the natural too. And I've seen both those adaptations. What I think is cool about it, Redford's character portrayal of it almost seems more, and I don't mean to use the word realistic, but like just because of the time the film was made, like the Gatsby has a lot of big Hollywood flair, which is cool. And I think Leo absolutely is awesome in that role. His ability to give you that 8 mile stare. I'll go with Leo just to keep in contemporary times. But let me say, I dig Robert Redford. I'm a big fan of his too.
What's your favorite jazz age beverage of choice?
Well, I mean, when I was in France, I tried out a little absinthe just for old time's sake, as they say, and Why not? Why not go with that? You know, it's very unique. It's a very unique drink. And I can see all the reasons why people got in trouble with it.
And lastly, Nick is about showcasing the trauma and the origins that brings us the Nick of Gatsby. And in some ways, we're all living through our own origin stories in a precursor to a new decade of the 20s right now. So do you think that we are on the verge of another jazz age or roaring 20s, so to speak?
I mean, I think we've got to be, don't we? I mean, like, I understand the roaring 20s a
I
lot
hope
better
so.
than I used to. Like, I kind of got it, you know, a country coming off 4 years of turmoil with the war, a country in transition, you know, people questioning and doubting and being curious about what the hell are we really doing, you know? So I fully expect once we start to get a few breaks, which I hope is coming soon, that there will be. I'll be roaring in these 20s. I hope everybody else will too. I hope we have lots of reasons to roar through them. That'd be great.
I hope so too. I will drink to that.
Yeah.
And I think Richard is rejoining us now. Great, just on time. Hi, Richard.
Okay, that's great. I hate to interrupt things, but I will say that we've got lots of questions from lots of people, and some of them are related. So I think what I'm going to try to do, Michael, is just kind of give you several of these at once, and then you can answer them however you like. One, Charlie Callis wants to know what it's like to write the prequel to what is considered to be the greatest American novel. Have you heard from this estate? Somebody else wants to know. Another person says, it's been 20 years since I've read Gatsby. Is it essential that I read it in order to appreciate Nick, or is it better just to go ahead and go on with Nick as it is? Can you talk about the intimidation factor of broaching this? What do you think Fitzgerald would say about your book?
Well, that's a lot of heavy questions, Richard.
Well, I'm letting you choose. You can answer them however you like.
Well, a couple of them kind of were similar in the intimidation factor and what it's like to do this. And about 5 minutes after that thing hit me, and I thought, well, why don't you do it? The next 5 minutes was full of all the things that would come with it, all the reaction that would come with it, the way people might take it, and so forth and so on. And to say that I didn't feel some level of intimidation, at least in the beginning of it, would be a lie, because I did. I felt the literary weight of it. I felt the heft of it. But I also came to the realization in the same time that you can do one of two things concerning this idea and like your emotional attachment to it. Because I never write any novel that I don't feel emotionally attached to, like from the first word. And I already felt that in thinking about Nick. You can embrace it and bring as much talent as you have to it and bring as much hard work as you have to it and do it with everything you can. Or you can be intimidated by it and shrink back into the corner and for the rest of your life wonder what the hell the experience would have been like and what the novel would have been like. And for me, that was a very simple answer. Just embrace it and take everything you have and go to it, and do it, you know. And that every time I felt doubt or I felt any type of intimidation about it, I always came back to that. And I wrote the novel that I wanted to read and the novel that I wanted to write, which was also, I think, a very important part of me writing it in quiet, and that I had somehow managed to focus and block out any type of distraction about it. And I think me not really telling anybody really helped with my own personal answer to the question, should you do it or should you not? And so the answer was yes. And I couldn't think of any good reason. I mean, being scared is not a reason to not do something, you know, and I wasn't going to do that. The Fitzgerald estate, I haven't heard from them personally, but we have heard from them that they are excited to see these things that are coming out. And Nick is the one that is coming out. So I guess that's what they were talking about. And in terms of that too, like I wrote this I think in great homage to Fitzgerald and in great homage to the Lost Generation. And I think my influence of the Lost Generation is evident in this book. You know, I've been asked over and over the years about my influences as a Southern writer and being from Mississippi and, you know, my other novels. And I've talked about Faulkner and Welty and, you know, Larry Brown and William Gay and all those writers. But even before that, my first influences were the expatriates and what was going on there in Paris because of my having lived there and been there. And like my true reading life actually kind of started while I was grabbing hold of those writers. And this was in a way very kind of a circular thing for me to do, to come back to that and to come back to those writers. And I would like to think Fitzgerald would be, you know, interested and proud of it. I think he would think I did Nick a very, treated him as humanly possible as I could treat him. And I'll just, you know, I'd be happy to show it to him, and maybe I will one day somewhere off in the wild blue yonder.
Jack Sony's got kind of an interesting question. He says, do you know or think that any of the early drafts of Gatsby had any of Nick's story that may have been cut by Perkins or Fitzgerald in revisions? That's an interesting idea.
That is an interesting idea. I don't know the answer to that. You know, Gatsby's such a kind of tightly packed novel. I would think there may have been some chunks cut out, but of what they are, I have no idea. I don't know.
He did have a great editor in Max Perkins.
Yes, he did. I mean, you know, Max Perkins taught Fitzgerald and Hemingway
I did want to
cut all the fat. So, you know. Yeah, Maureen?
I did want to say, to answer perspective, I would say you don't need to reread Gatsby. I hadn't revisited in about 10 years before reading Nick. And I actually think if you're thinking about revisiting it, it would be a richer experience to read Nick first and then carry the experience of reading that with you into reading Gatsby and have this wonderful, rich backstory for Nick. I think I myself can't wait to reread Gatsby now, having this perspective to carry along with me.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that question kind of skipped past me. But you know, one of the many balls to juggle with writing this novel is I also wanted to create a standalone, something that could stand alone, that you could read it and experience it for what it is, too, whether you know Gatsby or not. And like Maureen says, my answer to people has been, if you're going to revisit Gatsby or read it for the first time, read Nick first and then read Gatsby. And so far, the people who have done that, who have responded, you know, to me, of like, yeah, I think that's the way to do it. So,
yeah.
If I had to make a suggestion, I would agree with what Maureen says.
One person has asked, does the great influenza pandemic of 1918 make it into Nick? Another person, how do you make sure you stay true to Fitzgerald's writing and story, but still keep your own style?
The first part of that, yeah, there is a mention of the pandemic in Nick. Part of the long, strange trip was when I went back to revise this novel last year. It was striking to me how timely it felt, with things like a country in transition, a country that had been through a great deal of hardship, how gender roles had changed during World War I, the notion of laws changing and things changing, and you know, things being in fair amount of disarray in this country then, and then feeling it some now. And then, of course, the pandemic was an incredible parallel when I sat down to work on this last year. So yeah, it does rear its ugly head in Nick, just as it is now. What was that other question? I know, it was about, yeah. Well, you know, the very first thing I thought was, there ain't no way in hell this is going to be a first person novel, because then you have to mimic Fitzgerald, and I'm not in this business to sound like anybody else. I'm trying to sound like myself. So Nick is in third person, so that allows me to, when Nick's thinking, when Nick's having dialogue, that I can kind of fall in that framework of the character that I know he is and the way he talks, but also removed from that, with it being third person, I was free to be Michael Farris Smith and create those worlds around him.
I was so pleased to hear the kind of the origin story of Nick with you, and the fact that it was completely derived from inspiration, had nothing to do with knowledge about the copyright or what might happen or the estate, and you just set all those concerns aside and wrote the book you wanted to write. I think that's part of what makes it as great as it is. You didn't have to worry about all that crap. So
Yeah, I try not to worry about crap, Richard. It's not easy, but I try not to.
well, and did I ask you what would Fitzgerald say about your book? People, what do you think Fitzgerald would say about your book?
I think he'd love it. I mean, I can't imagine any reason he wouldn't. I was interviewing with NPR this morning and we talked about it, and I was like, I don't know that I could pay a greater homage to Fitzgerald and to Gatsby and to the Lost Generation. I mean, I know people are going to read this in 1,000 million different ways, and that's fine. I mean, I realized that from the moment this is what I decided I was going to do. But from my own personal experience with it, I feel like I paid a great tribute to someone who I admire greatly.
Okay, I've got one more question here. I'm gonna go with from a high school English teacher who confesses he's not a big fan of Gatsby. It's not currently on his syllabus or her syllabus, but let me see. I don't know whether this is a man or woman. This person's not opposed to including it. Its presence is ubiquitous in the high school classrooms across the country. I have two questions. As guidance for teachers, what do you wish students will take away from The Great Gatsby in preparing to read your novel? And what are a few texts that you feel are important for high school students to be acquainted with?
Oh my, an academic.
Well, that's a high school friendly.
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I'll be honest. When I see The Great Gatsby on high school reading lists, I'm like, how could those kids possibly connect with it? I mean, it's about things that, and everybody's maturity levels and experience levels are different, right? But I had to be like well on down the line and had lived and experienced quite a few things before it like really rang true with me, or before I could see what I thought it was about. The other part of that question was what things to suggest.
What books you would recommend?
What other books?
Well, you know what? I think it's important because I've been to high school. I'm a reader now. I mean, I picked up Gatsby 5 years ago because I was looking for something short to read. I mean, I think some of my favorite books are novellas, and I don't think it's any accident that my first book, The Hands of Strangers, was a novella. I think The Stranger by Camus, it's a great novella. I think The Ballad of the Sad Cafe by Carson McCullers is I still, every time I read that book, I don't know how Carson McCullers got all of that complexity and dynamic into 82 pages. It just completely blows me away. And I think it has themes that high schoolers can relate to, both The Stranger and The Ballad of the Sad Cafe. And I would say along the same lines, I mean, if you're going to do any Hemingway, I think, The Old Man and the Sea is something we can relate to because it's about perseverance and it's about the human will and the human spirit. And I feel like, as are those other books, and I feel like those are things like any reader at any age should kind of grab onto. Whereas I think Gatsby, because of the language, it might be a little intimidating or a little bit might sense, someone who's 16 years old, like, and just trying to kind of get a hold of it, right? Where I think some of those other, like The Stranger, they're so direct, and Ballad of the Sad Cafe, like you can just walk down that line, and there's complexities in them that I think make for great discussion too. Because when I've taught those books, I've always had great discussions with students about them.
Those are great recommendations. I'm going to about to close it down. I'm going to ask Maureen for a final comment if you wish, and then Michael, if you have a closing comment. But before that, I failed to announce earlier that our next event will be on Monday at 5 o'clock with Michael Bible, who actually used to be a bookseller at Square Books, and he's written a small novel, novella, The Ancient Hours, and he'll be in conversation with Bill Boyle, on Monday at 5 p.m. But I want to thank you both for doing this today. It was a great conversation. Maureen?
Thank you so much, Richard, for having me. Thank you all for tuning in and watching. If you want to hear more from both me and Michael, there is an interview with him that I wrote in the January issue of Entertainment Weekly. So go ahead and check that out and pick up Nick tomorrow.
Yes, thank you very much, Maureen, for doing this with us. And I just want to say to everyone, thank you. And to Richard, I mean, I used to dream about having my books in Square Books, and like to be able to walk in that bookstore now and to almost have a whole shelf of Michael Farris Smith. It's really rewarding. And everybody, remember your indie bookstores, and I'm happy to sign books right to you. There's a link on my website to order directly from Square Books, and I can take care of that any day of the week. So thank you to everyone. I hope you'll enjoy and experience this novel the same way I did.
Thank you, Michael, and happy birthday.
Happy birthday. Right on.
All right.
Happy birthday.
Good night, everybody.